So hi there, everybody. I'm Laura Brandis, and for those of you who don't already know me, I'm the Communications Director at the POLIS Water Sustainability Project at the University of Victoria. I want to thank all of you for joining us here today at our first webinar of the new year, which is part of our Creating a Blue Dialogue webinar series. A warm welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time, and a big welcome back to those of you who have joined us before. Today's webinar brings together two social innovation scholars who will be discussing the role that innovation can play to both build resilience as well as to build capacity to solve the complex problems being faced in watersheds across Canada and around the globe. Now, before we dive into the presentations, I do want to take a moment to thank our partners and supporters. You can see our series partners here, Canadian Water Network, Water Canada Magazine, as well as the Centre for Global Studies, which is where POLIS is housed at the University of Victoria. And for this specific webinar, I want to say a thank you to the UVic Department of Geography, as well as the Waterloo Institute for Social Innovation and Resilience, and the University of Waterloo. And as well, a big thank you to our funding supporters, whose logos you can see there. So those of you who have attended our webinars before know that I like to run through just a few quick housekeeping items before we start. The first thing is audio. As I'm sure you've all realized, I have a blanket mute on all of the participants. The reason for this is to avoid any feedback or extraneous background noise so that you can really focus on the presenters. So because you're muted, this is going on to point 2, the way the question period will work is we'll make use of the chat box, which you've already been making use of. So after both Michelle and Francis give their presentations, we'll have an open question period where you can type your questions in that box. I'll read them out as the moderator, and both Michelle and Francis will have their voices on the line as our panelists. And to make use of that chat box right now, I'd love if you would like to introduce yourselves so we can get a sense of who all is in the room with us here today. So if you want to just tell us who you are, what organization you're with, and also how many people are listening on your end. I know some people have a group, just so that we can get a really nice picture. And as you continue to introduce yourselves to each other, I will go ahead and introduce today's speakers. So our main speaker today is Dr. Michele-Lee Moore. She's an assistant professor in the geography department here at the University of Victoria, and she's also the director of UVic's brand new Water Innovation and Global Governance Lab. And this past September, she joined us here at POLIS as a research associate and strategic advisor. Michelle has a passion for creating positive, transformative change, and her research looks toward public policy and institutional structures and processes as places where this change can really occur. Her current research program examines how innovation in water governance is either generated, supported, adopted, or institutionalized by Canada's water-related activities at the global level. And our second speaker today is Dr. Frances Westley, who is the J.W. McConnell Chair in Social Innovation at the University of Waterloo. And in that role, she leads a research team dedicated to understanding social innovation. Frances is a renowned scholar and consultant in the areas of social innovation, strategies for sustainable development, strategic change, visionary leadership, and interorganizational collaboration. She serves on numerous advisory boards, is on the editorial board of several journals, and she's also the recipient of multiple awards in innovation and conservation. And I'm thrilled to have both Michele-Lee and Frances with us here today. And at this point, I'm going to hand the mic over to them. So both Michelle and Frances, if you're muted, if you'd please bring your voices on the line, we'd love to hear you.
Hi there, Frances.
Hello.
Hi, Frances.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Are you there, Michelle?
Whoops.
Can you
We
hear
were
me
having
okay
some
now?
glitches with Michelle's audio earlier. It may be Michelle, since you were muted, that it reset. I may ask you to call in again and on the telephone, and then maybe you can switch to your computer mic like we did earlier.
Okay.
Great. So Michelle's on that. Francis, while we're waiting for Michelle to come back, did you have anything to add to the introduction, or did you want to say anything to the group before you guys start presenting?
Well, I could just, set a kind of an overview of the challenges around environmental issues and the roles of networks. I mean, before I got into specifically looking at social innovation and transformation, I was actually very concerned with problems in sustainability and ecosystem management in particular, and obviously water somewhat falls under that. And I think everyone agrees that these really are the most complex problems that we're facing today because they're both social and ecological. And as we seek to work our way through a better handle on how to intervene for positive change, innovation, and transformation, I think Michele-Lee and her work on networks, both at local and global scales is one of the most interesting approaches that I've encountered. So I'm really pleased to be on this call with her today.
Everyone hear me now?
Great. Thanks, Francis. Michelle, I'm just doing a little bit of...
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Wonderful.
It seems that half the people could hear you before, so maybe in the chat box, if you can just let us know if anybody can't hear Michelle, that might be more useful.
Well,
If you can hear me now, I'll just stay on the phone. That's fine.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm just going to assume that it's working unless someone lets me know otherwise, so please take it away. Oh, actually, before you do that, I did want to just let the participants know that our speakers have engagements right after the webinar, so we're going to have to cut it short right at 10. So I'll remind you of that again when we get to the discussion period. Just wanted to give you a heads up. Okay, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Laura, and thank you as well to POLIS for the opportunity to participate in the Blue Dialogue series. And also thanks to all of you out there online. It's nice to see some familiar names in the box there, as well as some new ones. So the presentation that Francis and I are going to go back and forth on today is a bit of a whirlwind tour of looking at the role of transnational networks and innovation in building resilience for watershed governance. And one of the things that challenges the resilience of watershed governance are extremely complex problems or crises. So people often want to debate, do we need a crisis to mobilize people to get them to behave differently, or do we need a crisis to get the political will and the financial resources devoted to improving water governance? We don't really want to debate that today. Instead, we'd rather focus on the question that if a crisis occurs, whether it's naturally caused or human-induced, are we and our watersheds going to be resilient? Are there lessons from other places that can help us understand how to best build that resilience and build our capacity to innovate and adapt to essentially disasters or crises or complex problems? So I'm going to start us off briefly, but then Francis will discuss examples of crises in sectors outside of water governance, areas such as health, international development, and describe some of the social, cultural, and organizational issues that act as barriers to resilience.
Michele-Lee?
Sure.
Yes. We're getting messages that you've got a nasty echo on. Have you got your computer mic turned off? Have you got the sound off on your computer?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, everyone. Is that sounding better? Hopefully. So Francis is going to be taking a look at these different sectors to describe some of these barriers to resilience during those times, and also speak to the opportunities that crisis can create as well. I will then put forward some ideas about how networks, specifically transnational networks, link domestic watershed organizations to organizations outside of the basin and outside of the country in which the watershed is situated, and how they can help to address the barriers described by Francis. So essentially the point I'm making is that networks can help turn the barriers into opportunities when they are used by organizations to provide support to the process of creating innovative governance strategies. While Francis will be drawing on cases from across a number of different sectors, I'll be drawing on research that I have conducted on the networks of two river basin organizations, specifically the Murray-Darling Basin Authority in Australia and the Prachinburi River Basin Committee in Thailand. So let's start by getting some of this terminology out of the way that we'll be using. What does it mean to be resilient? Well, resilience by definition is about being able to withstand disturbance while still maintaining a certain level of functioning, and it's based on having the ability to learn, adapt, and to transform. There are different factors that help ensure whether we are resilient enough in our watersheds to withstand such disturbances, and I'm going to focus on two of these. The first factor involves innovation. Innovation is an important part of what builds our ability to learn and change and respond to disturbances. I see it as critical to resilience. If you want to be resilient, you need to be able to innovate and make change happen. However, I would emphasize that when I talk about innovation in water, I'm not only referring to the need for innovative solutions, but we also need innovations in how we create solutions. And this often comes down to making changes in how we are governing water. There is no doubt that the word innovation is a buzzword these days, but it is often used as shorthand for creating efficiencies or improvements to existing processes or products. I'm using it a bit differently here. I'm talking about water governance innovations, which are defined as any strategy, program, policy, process, or initiative that transforms the standard management routines or the resources and authority flows in a watershed, or the beliefs of the governance system in which the innovation is occurring. So the type of innovation that I'm interested in is really about changing systems. And changing governance systems will involve more than creating a new technological fix. What I will also say is that governance innovation is not just about a final product, it's a process. And the research is very clear that the process of innovation involves multiple phases. And moving through those phases often takes a combination of strategic management by someone or in some cases by multiple people, and an openness to opportunities or ideas that emerge. Now, related to that process of innovation is the second factor of resilient watersheds that I want to highlight, which is networks. So research from a variety of disciplines tells us that in order to generate new initiatives, programs, or policies, you have to access different forms of knowledge and resources. So networks may be one way to ensure that we have that level of access to different resources. I would also add that it has become commonplace amongst practitioners and researchers to recognize that in order to deal with governance challenges in water, we're often mentioning we need people working at all different levels. So again, networks may be important to ensuring that we have that interaction across the different levels. However, when we're talking about needing innovation in order to be resilient and respond to crisis or complex problems, there's obviously significant tensions when trying to innovate or change the very same system that has just undergone a crisis or disaster. So networks will never be able to remove that tension entirely, but the evidence does indicate that it may help us to kind of move through those tensions. So I'm going to turn it over to Frances at this particular moment, and she's going to be describing three of the main tensions and paradoxes that are faced during disasters across different sectors and how they serve as barriers to resilience. And then I'll hop back on the line to describe how networks and innovation can help us minimize those three barriers and challenges in order for us in the water sector to ensure that resilience is maintained.
Okay, thanks, Michele-Lee. So what I'm going to be speaking about in the next 10 minutes or so is some work that I've done with a colleague in the Resilience Alliance, Brian Walker, which is on crisis and disasters and their impact on resilience. So how resilient are communities, whether they're a governance community, whether it's a watershed management community, whether it's a local community, to shocks of various kinds. And as we know, many of those shocks are environmental. In fact, we have an increase in environmental crises happening currently. So Brian and I came up with this topic because we were both invited to a conference in Ditchley in England that has these big sort of think tank conferences for people from the UK and from North America. And this was on this issue of crisis society's resilience in the face of crisis. And many of the people there were people whose job was to manage these crises. So we, in 3 very, very stimulating days, Brian and I took many long walks and started to think about what we were hearing. And one of the things that we heard when we looked at it from what we knew about resilience was that there were 3 paradoxes. I'm going to touch on each one of these lightly, and I'm going to give you examples that we use in a paper that we wrote together that aren't about watershed, but I think can give some insights about how the global community and the regional national communities respond to crisis in general. So the first paradox that we heard listening to these very experienced people from all over the world was the paradox of time. When a crisis occurs, whether it's a health crisis, an environmental crisis, man-made crisis, the authorities or the governing system responsible for the crisis moves into gear very quickly. And there's a common understanding that there's a 3-day window with which to deal with the crisis. So in fact, you need to get in and out quickly with very specific plans for how to do it, and that if more time than that passes, you probably, in their terms, kind of lost control of this crisis. So when we think about the Canadian government or any national government deciding to respond to the crisis in Haiti, for example, the notion is that you move in very quickly and you have your clear checklist of the beds that need distributing, the medical care that you need to bring in, and you bring your team, your highly experienced team in, and they respond to that as rapidly as possible. But that, there was good sense behind that. But one of the 2 things that we began to hear more about was what some of the participants sort of tongue-in-cheek called the Murphy waterbed syndrome, which was the problem with these quick responses to crises, was that it was like a waterbed. When you tried to push it down in one area, it would just pop up in the next. So, these kind of highly interventionary quick responses don't tend to assume a complexity or a broad system perspective. They're responding to particular symptoms that they see, and that's the only way you can do it that quickly. So Brian and I began to discuss, a concept which is probably familiar to most of you about general versus specific resilience. General being, a society, let's say a country or a region or a community or maybe even an organization, whatever your unit of analysis is, what's their general capacity to respond to shocks, and then how does that manifest itself or fail to manifest itself in a very specific crisis. And of course, in today's highly connected world, many specific crises are handled not locally or even nationally, but internationally. So as we begin to think about this paper, we actually looked more closely into the crisis in Haiti, and I was invited to come and speak to a group of ADMs in Canada who were puzzling through, the adequacy of their responses, and they talked a lot about this crisis and what they found frustrating and difficult about it, and how important it was in terms of their own accountability scheme to, as we'd heard initially, to move quickly, to have a clear targets of the things that they were supposed to distribute and accomplish, to be able to check those lists off, to be able to account for that to back home and to the international media that was watching, and their own sense that in fact this wasn't an adequate response, but a clear delineation between what they said was the crisis response and the reconstruction phases. So they saw their duty as that crisis response, but were concerned about the reconstruction phases. And about that time, my attention was drawn to some coverage about the crisis in Haiti in the Associated Press, which suggested that only a fraction of the billions of dollars that was collected around the world by the Red Cross to be spent in this crisis had actually been distributed. And the reason for that, given by the Red Cross, who of course also have their own very strict accountability guidelines, was the fact that their mandate only allowed for the distribution of these resources to local organizations who were thought themselves to be solvent, resilient, etc. And this was for the reconstruction. Closer look by the Associated Press suggested that most of the local organizations had thrown all their resources into the disaster relief phase, and so basically were no longer solvent in that sense of the word. So the money was held up, and from a point of view of general versus specific resilience, you could make an argument that Haiti's general resilience was actually reduced. So their capacity within their own country to respond to future crises was reduced and not increased. So, this paradox between general versus specific remains very alive, and I think there's some interesting implications there, which Michele-Lee will pick up on, around, how networks can play a role both in general and in specific. So the second paradox that we encountered was the paradox of accountability. So there was much discussion about the fact that, that learning is vital, particularly for general resilience. If you don't learn from one crisis, how, in fact, are you going to increase your social capacity to deal with multiple crises? And this is just as true of watershed management as anything else. But in the moment of crisis response, the need for accountability and the tendency to try to point fingers, to proportion blame, is extremely high. And that, of course, prevents learning from happening, because if, in fact, what you need to do is to avoid being attacked and shown to have been irresponsible, you need this highly controlled approach, which I just described, which is that you follow your protocols, you deliver what you're supposed to deliver, you do exactly what you're supposed to do, and if something goes wrong, this is something to be hidden, not learned from. And this seemed to be, to plague all aspects of crisis response. At the same large ADM conference, there were people, though, who wanted to raise the example of SARS in Toronto, and they said, we actually had a reasonable response, but that was partly based on, we didn't have a reasonable response. Sorry, we were all had a poor response to SARS. Toronto, for example, felt they'd been caught completely flat-footed by the whole SARS crisis. But they felt that when the H1N1 crisis was threatening, that they'd actually managed to learn from the SARS crisis. And so they felt like, unlike many, they were poised to do that. Part of that was a kind of a increasing familiarity among the healthcare professionals and the governance system for healthcare in Ontario with this whole notion of complexity thinking and this need for building general resilience. So after the SARS failure, there had been some real effort to document the difference between hospitals that had been really overwhelmed, and there was a lot of really post-traumatic stress among healthcare workers who were involved, and ones that in fact had managed the crisis much better. And to everyone's interest, the hospitals which seemed to come out on top were hospitals which in previous study of a quite separate study of healthcare in Ontario had been actually listed as what they call magnet hospitals, which was in fact hospitals that attracted very good quality workers and tended to be able to keep good quality workers. And so when they then went in and looked at, say, well, why, what was attracting these workers, and why was it that these hospitals were also able to respond better to crisis, they discovered a particular aspect of organization, which was this capacity for consultation across levels. There was a concern with social justice, so the hierarchy was relatively low, or if not low, at least porous. It was easy to communicate across the levels. There was a system of more decentralized decision-making and self-governance and greater flexibility in terms of staff assignments, et cetera, than you saw in other hospitals that had failed. And most importantly, a kind of a learning culture, avoiding blame and emphasizing learning. And when you looked across other studies of communities and even of individuals who are resilient, you find a very similar pattern of an emphasis on the capacity of individuals in the system to respond with some control, to make sense of the situation they're in, to be able to draw on the resources of others easily and at their own will to try to solve a crisis. And so, we began to think about the fact that there actually are cultures of general resilience. And again, I think an interesting question is, to what way can networks actually help to build these kinds of cultures? How might they contribute to a culture of learning versus blame, to a culture of where people felt that they, could draw on resources to make decisions, and to feel they had some self-governance. So the last paradox, which was the paradox of deliberate versus emergent response, was the one that many of the government officials, both at the ADM meeting and in Ditchley, felt was perhaps the worst one, which was that most of the best solutions to a crisis are actually emergent. They emerge locally from individuals, the group's capacity to use their own resources, their own experience, their own learning to come up with solutions. And yet, because of the way we organize or choose to govern, crisis, both at international, national, local levels, the onus was on the government to plan for crisis and, as I described before, to have this kind of quick response in which didn't privilege, often undermined local solutions or local approaches, but was in fact good choices in terms of the capacity to be accountable or to rend accountability. So when you look at this from a point of view of networks, and this will be my last slide, many of you will be familiar to the emerging trend to try to use global networks and social media as indicators of emerging crises. I remember seeing many years ago one of the first TED Talks, Lara Brilliant, talking about how when it comes to epidemics, early detection and early response is absolutely key. And we know about the bird flu warnings that actually a group in Ottawa had developed a web crawler that was able to pick up indicators from local actors, healthcare workers, reports, etc., long before the WHO networks could actually pick this up and respond to it, and signal that information that a crisis was emerging, that the epidemic was breaking out in particular areas much quicker than, in fact, the normal procedures that were, our governance mechanisms for responding to crisis. And of course, you can argue there are good reasons for, the more centralized approaches to all these things. But in fact, in some cases, and we know with highly complex systems, that these kinds of thresholds or tipping points, are key. When we get past them, it's often very hard to recover. And it appears there that, again, this emphasis on local and how we bring the local to the attention of, the broader governance system, how we allow for a quicker reaction through being able to build on these local responses seems a very key way to both innovate, but also to build resilience of our systems in the face of other kinds of crises. So I'll stop there and I'll hand it back to Michele-Lee.
Okay, great, thanks, Frances. So having looked across these broader fields to understand the experiences during disaster, let's examine the evidence now that suggests that networks can help support the process of innovation and minimize these barriers, which Frances was beginning to hint at there in her examples. So the first paradox related to time and the tension between needing a quick response versus a longer time period to rebuild and be resilient. Let's look at how networks help us address this barrier, making change happen. Now, partly the answer for this lies in the structure of networks. So when we talk about networks, it's important to recognize there are different structures or ways in which they can be organized. So some examples here. One is the classic hub and spoke network in the top left, which would have a river basin organization, for instance, in the middle surrounded by others. That's a useful structure for communicating information in a one-way direction. It's often a go-to during a time of crisis. But if you're trying to build long-term resilience and come up with a different way of doing things, this does not get you very far. A second type of network structure is called the small world network on the top right. Many of you have heard of the 6 degrees of separation. We're all related to Kevin Bacon somehow. That's this type of network, which is characterized by strong, close relationships with high levels of trust. There's an efficiency to these networks because the bonds are so tight. So if you want someone to adopt a new way of doing things, these kinds of networks can be where it happens quite quickly, since once one person does it, many others who trust and know that person will also consider adopting it. But adopting something is only one part of the puzzle in innovation. I mentioned that there are these different phases, and in innovation you need to first come up with the new program or policy or initiative. So there's several stages before adoption that are important to the process. Therefore, research has found that the network, shaped like the one on the bottom with dense clusters linked together by a bridge or what we often call brokers who share and translate knowledge and ideas from one cluster to another, can be an optimal network structure for supporting innovation. So I conducted a social network analysis to better understand how watershed organizations may or may not be connected to organizations outside of their own watershed and outside of their own country in which they're situated. And there's two findings I want to discuss from that. Firstly, in conducting the social network analysis, and I was conducting some interviews, generally I would first start with an interview and explain I was there to discuss these networks, and people would say something to the effect of, oh, you know, we don't have any international networks, or we're not connected to internationally. And then they would go on for the next 60 to 90 minutes discussing the range of connections that they had and the benefits that they received from that network relationship. And after hearing the comment so many times, when I started tracing through to figure out how is it that there's this discrepancy in how people are actually connected versus how they seem to think they're not connected, I realized that people often connect to other organizations in various parts of the world for their own niche area of expertise. So people responsible for developing a stakeholder consultation program, for instance, were connected to organizations that focused on public participation and policy. You know, while the engineer responsible for operating a dam is going to be connected to organizations related to dam safety, for instance. But what that meant was that there was, as individuals, they were unable to kind of quote unquote see the whole network that the River Basin organization was connected to. And this included, and perhaps you could even say was especially true for executives in the organizations. Now, why does that matter? Well, it means that there's a limited grasp on the vast extent of resources that can be accessed quickly through the diverse network relationships. And that are collectively contained within an organization. And it means that there's no one strategically trying to build relationships where it may be useful or leveraging those that do exist. So it was ad hoc and not really done strategically at the organizational level. Just a quick shot of what then the structure of the network actually looks like for these different watersheds. There's a lot of different ways to analyze social network data, and there's a lot of different insights we could talk about with this particular network graph. It's just one way to visually represent the network, but I want to show you, just point out two things quickly. The different colors represent different organizational scales. So for instance, light blue dots represent the international organizations, while dark green dots might represent a national or subnational government agency that lies outside of the country in which the basin is situated. So most importantly, you can see that in both the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and the Prachinburi River Basin Committee in Thailand, they're both connected across multiple organizational scales. That might not be surprising to all of you, but it kind of gave us, it was useful in that we haven't been able to graph out this complexity before and show these cross-scale interactions, so it gives us an important baseline. The second thing I want to highlight is that you do see within these structures some elements of that dense clustering and the bridges linking otherwise disconnected groups, right? And in both river basin organizations, it turns out that those light blue dots, the international organizations, often played a critical role in serving as bridges. And this was interesting to me because I think it's not something that in watersheds we're always thinking of when we're considering how to respond to a crisis. So for instance, Australia, we know they've been facing a severe drought. I don't think they were necessarily thinking of we should contact UNESCO. And yet, if you see on the lower right-hand side, UNESCO is a light blue dot that is connecting these two otherwise dense clusters that would not be connected. So that brings me to the second paradox that Francis had highlighted, which involved that tension between the global and the local and the need for local solutions to emerge. So what I did find when I was studying governance innovations and how they unfolded in these different watersheds, that river basin organizations engaged locally and globally at different times in the process of trying to make innovation happen. So when watershed organizations were trying to create a new idea and develop an innovation, generate it, local networks were really important, but they weren't necessarily in contact at that point with the global level networks. So the innovations we're generating out of this local watershed context But what was interesting was when they had actually announced it or adopted it, whatever it was, a new program or new policy, when they went to the latter stages of that innovation process where you're going to actually implement the innovation and institutionalize it, the river basin organizations began to interact with global networks at that point. I'll give you one quick example from the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. They've been undertaking a basin planning process for several years. It was finally adopted in November, this past November. But the staff there spent 3 years creating and adopting different innovative governance strategies that will and are transforming the water governance system. So one quick example, the sustainable diversion limits is one innovative governance strategy. They're intended to set new limits on the amount of surface and groundwater that can be used. And what they're going to do is base it on a proportion of water available in the river in any given year, rather than being based on a historic volume considered to remain constant each year, which is the way many of us develop our allocation systems. And with that sustainable diversion limits, they're going to require significantly less water to be used than in the past in an attempt to better protect key ecological assets. And they have a formally adopted environmental buyback strategy, which involves compensating licensed water users to give back water to achieve the newly defined sustainable diversion limits. But then the Murray-Darling Basin Authority uses that reacquired volume of water and tries to ensure that certain volumes of that water flow to priority, what they call critical sites. So they use those 18, they have 18 different critical sites for environmental watering as all part of the sustainable diversion strategy. So again, these strategies developed locally, but when it came time for implementation, the Murray-Darling Basin sought out international experts in order to conduct a peer review. So they invited 5 different experts to the basin for 2 weeks where they reviewed documents as well as some of the hydrological models and the climatic modeling that they were using to inform the diversion limits. And then the Murray-Darling Basin Authority published the formal written reports from the peer review online, wrote responses to each report, detailed out what was or was not changed in the Basin Plan in order to meet the criticisms during that review. So the Basin Plan is a formal governance document that they will adopt that's implemented through the authority granted to the Murray-Darling Basin Authority in their 2007 Water Act. So in terms of impacts on regulatory governance instruments, there was clear evidence that networked relationships were shaping these governance innovations as they were being implemented. But there are also implications for this human side of water governance, and it brings me to the third paradox that Francis had mentioned about dealing with this accountability and blame and the need to create organizational cultures that help build resilience. So again, networks help accomplish this. So given that the river basin organizations were undertaking processes of innovation, the experiences and contexts were unfamiliar at times. It's very common during a crisis situation, and some of the changes were very controversial. So when they released a draft of the Basin Plan in 2011, the farmers were so outraged over the proposed reductions associated with those sustainable diversion limits that I mentioned, they were on the news burning copies of the draft out in their fields, which I would say is another important innovation or message that innovation does not just slide easily into place. So individuals seem to need to go through that process of figuring out their own role. And the network ties help them build confidence or reassure individuals when they feel uncertain about the process or need to reconcile the fact that these decisions that they're making have no kind of quote-unquote right answer. They're complex solutions for complex problems. And I have these 2 quotes here, which I'll let you read yourselves, which I think emphasize this point. One participant actually said it was working in this space where you could see the science stop and the policy begin. And I really liked that quote. There was always uncertainty about how to respond to these crises. People second-guessed whether they had enough data, whether the river basin organization was heading in the right direction, whether the models were right, or whether they were going to implement all that they were promising to deliver. And with this sense of responsibility came a sense of wanting to learn. It was a really important motivation for why people within a river basin organization would reach out to people outside of the basin and outside of their own country. And so what I found was that the network ties help put the complexity of that watersheds challenge into a broader context and help reassure them or remind them that the work they were doing was important. And in that way, the network helps to build and enhance the capacity of a watershed organization to be resilient in the face of a crisis. Many people, when they're talking about network, will bring up The fact that, when you're at a conference, it's, the real conversation happens at the dinner table or over coffee. And in fact, that's a perfect example of this point of, people might stand up and give a presentation that's really their organization's position, but when they're having that coffee or dinner conversation more informally, they have a chance to sort of explain how they feel about it or test out different ideas and express some of those concerns. And so it gives people a chance to reconcile their position or try on the multiple hats that inevitably we all wear today. So again, networks help to build that culture of resilience. So just quickly in summary, what have we learned from all of this? What's the take-home message? Well, innovation is important to building resilience. There are barriers too, but also opportunities for innovation that exist in times of crisis. And we talked about 3 barriers in particular. Networks can help support innovation while simultaneously minimizing those barriers to change. But I would say that these networks are often neither visible nor strategically created at the organizational level. Local and global networks do play different roles at different times in the innovation process. We saw that. And global networks in particular bring the benefits of both shaping regulatory governance instruments, but also having significant benefits to the learning and confidence of staff. So I'll just end it there. I don't know, Frances, if you want to add one more reflection in at the end there, or whether we can open it up for the question and answer.
Yeah, Michele-Lee, thanks for that. I do really love this work that you're doing on it, and I would just add one little piece. Going back to the, the whole issue around building cultures, I think, a piece for me that your work highlights is that particularly in developing area countries, the ways in which this connection to global networks actually build a sense of coherence for actors working at local levels. So they become they have more confidence in their own capacity to respond and to introduce innovation. They draw a lot of strength, even a sense of identity from this connection to global networks. So, I think that's a really important part. We've seen some examples in the work that I've done of local actors who, even with the collapse of a government, and this was in Africa, were able to continue to work around maintaining a conservation position. These were endangered species in Africa, based on their connection to global networks, which certainly raised their own sense of efficacy to enormously. I think that the tension that isn't here is you sort of think of networks as, that I think still remains, is you think of networks as being these kind of quick response mechanisms, as in the case of bird flu, et cetera, and epidemics. But in fact, I think your work really indicates that their contribution to building these kind of cultures of resilience, because I think that networks actually are ideal learning mechanisms, and they aren't as hooked into systems of accountability as are hierarchies and organizations that have to exist. Now, you can see that as a bit of a downside in the sense that you can say, well, yeah, but what about accountability? But on the other hand, given the sort of dead weight, the immobilizing effect of that, having the two together, networks and hierarchies in a sense, I think offers a tremendous source of resilience and innovation, as I think your work indicates. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks to both of you. At this point, I'm going to open up the floor for questions. I see there's already been a couple comments coming in through the chat box, and we have about between 10 and 15 minutes for questions. As I said, we are going to need to end right at 10 today, so please start typing away. The first comment that came through was in response to when Frances was talking about Paradox 2, and I just want to read that out to ensure everybody sees, from Angela, which is, a good example of admitting failure and learning from your experiences is the Engineers Without Borders Canada Failure Report, not specific to crises, but to development and change. So that may be something that some folks on the line might be interested in looking into. And question from Nancy, did you look at the role of specific individuals in maintaining networks? So maybe UNESCO was an important bridge, but if a key person left, was there enough redundancy to ensure connections were retained? Also, did you look at what criteria influenced that? For instance, was size an important criteria in determining whether an organization could retain its networks if a key individual left? So Michelle or Frances?
Yeah. Okay, so thank you, Nancy. There's a lot of questions there. I will say that in this particular work I wasn't, but I have in other work that I've done, absolutely the role of individuals is critical to maintaining networks. That's what makes them actually quite distinct from an organization, a formal organization, in that if a person leaves, network ties do leave, whereas if a person leaves an organization, that position still exists. So you're right in that UNESCO was an important bridge. In that case, there were multiple people linked to UNESCO. There was some level of redundancy, but those are all parts of what you can analyze using social network analysis as a tool to look at whether there are kind of what they call structurally equivalent either network nodes. In terms of the individuals themselves, we do know quite a bit about, or have spent some time trying to figure out, maybe I should say, what sort of skill sets people need. Is it something that we can train? We know that there are certain people who are good at being able to serve as brokers compared to people that are going to be in one of those dense clusters, for instance. We know that certain people within the network serve important to almost recharge people, keep people engaged in the network. Those can be quite different skill sets, obviously. We also, in terms of people being able to do this strategically, somehow being able to see, there are a few individuals out there who seem to just be able to do this. It's trying to understand what attribute it is of them that makes them quite competent at this is still, we're still trying to figure that out, follow these people around and study them. But absolutely, the roles of individuals is important in building those networks. It is a personal connection, often, even though it is for professional reasons. In terms of the size, what's this, for instance, the size an important criteria in determining whether an organization could retain its networks? I actually found it wasn't. Because it comes down to individuals within that organization, the Prachinburi River Basin Committee, a much smaller organization to the 200 people strong that are in the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, and yet certainly a fewer connections, but still considerable number of connections to a transnational network.
Great. Did you have anything to add to that, Frances?
Nope. I think that's the way I would have answered that.
Okay. A question from Kate Lindsay. So I understand the value and importance of social networks for enhancing resiliency of watershed management, but what happens after the networks are defined? How does it become part of the management after they have been done?
Not sure if I quite understand, but I think what you're saying is once you've actually kind of graphed out these networks, how do you use that as a manager? Is that the question then? I'll go with that. Go with that as you confirm. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So to be honest, that's a question that remains to be seen to some extent, in that I haven't found a river basin organization that has graphed those out and then used them as a management tool at the global level. At the local level, that is a little bit more common. I know, for instance, in the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, they actually had kind of mapped out their local networks to make sure that when they were doing their consultation processes, that they were covering all the groups that were involved locally. So that becomes a very clear way to use that those network structures. But I would say that from a strategic perspective, it would be worth sitting back as a manager in those, the executive in the organizations, to be able to sit back and actually look at how many resources are there and whether or not you have sufficient capacity to respond to some of the kind of upcoming challenges that you foresee, or whether new network connections need to be made. In some ways, it's just about understanding, I suppose, your social capital budget and using that to inform your decision-making processes. And also, during a crisis, being able to very quickly kind of have that at your fingertips.
Yes, and I would add to that I think it's one of the current challenges in governance of all kinds of problem domains, and in government as well, which is how you use networks. And I think that lots of people actually haven't figured that out yet. So there's there are not very many really good examples of government creatively using networks, as Michele-Lee pointed out, strategically using networks, they tend to exist as kind of collateral structures, meaning that they're almost like parallel universes that, have an influence on each other, but aren't deliberately or strategically connected. So that's, this has been a change that has grown so rapidly, this, power of networking, along with, the capacity for social media, as well as just, getting together at conferences and things, that's a huge area of potential innovation.
Great, thanks. So the next comment that came in is quite long. I may not read the whole thing, if that's okay with everybody on the line. I think you can perhaps read the setup here. So just teleporting our minds for a moment to the Indus River Basin, and then there's a bit of a summary about what exactly is happening there. And the ultimate question is, how can local actions ameliorate this problem? The water treaty doesn't account for future water stresses or scarcity. So Pakistani farmers downstream are seeing increased periodic floods and increasingly saline water. So there's a bit of politics happening with dams that are being built in that region. I don't know, Michelle or Francis, if you're familiar with what's happening there or not.
Not with this particular case, but I think what you're asking, if I understand correctly, is there's some type of international structure in place, in this case a law, that is, that has the, I suppose, authority to implement these dams, and then you're wondering about how do local actions kind of deal with a decision that's made at that international level that's affecting them locally. Is that correct?
So I think it's Justin Ming who asked this question.
Right. Hi, Justin. And how can local actions ameliorate this problem? So in some ways there's no formula for what the local action actually looks like. But I think what's important to remember is that if we're trying to grapple with these kind of cross-scalar problems, what we do know about if you're trying to make change happen, which I think is what you're asking about, is about how can the local people kind of create that, mobilize and create that innovative process to respond and change the governance system perhaps, or at least change the outcome of that international law. What we do know, again, is that it's about thinking about it as a process. And that was something that came up for me in the watersheds where I was working, is that for what we do know, there's a growing body of research, still fairly early days, looking at the process of innovation. But there is this growing body that's coming up with some very clear patterns in what that process looks like, which stages you need to move through. It's not entirely linear, but there are different distinct stages, and there's distinct sort of actions that you need to take and resources that you need to take in each of those. So for instance, you need to go through a process of, in a complex problem, actually kind of building a sense-making process is what I would call it, of actually trying to build an understanding of what the problem actually is, the root of the problem, and then go through a process of generating some innovative possible solutions. But then importantly, the next phase is actually going through an evaluation process, so trying to determine which innovative solutions are you going to try out, because you can only invest so much resources in different options, so you do need to go through a process of selecting which ones you're going to try out. And again, there's never, there's so much uncertainty. There isn't a best one. There's just ones to try out and experiment with, and that's often extremely difficult, again, because of the accountability paradox, and again, because of our limited resources to do that. But having kind of a bit of an openness to that experimentation at a local level, piloting out things, projects, and then after that, evaluating those pilot projects and selecting one and starting to leverage greater and greater resources, ideally through your network, is all part of that process before it kind of gets to being able to be implemented. So that's sort of I suppose a crude version of describing some of those different phases to innovation. And what I found in the watersheds where I was working is that very few people are thinking about these kinds of changes in an innovation process type of way, right? They're just sort of going about it in a more ad hoc way, and yet we have this strategic process from research that could probably be used to inform that quite well. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm just looking at the clock, and I think we have time for one more question. There's one here from Nelson Jatel. So I'm just going to let everybody on the line know if you do have further questions that you're itching to ask. You're welcome to write them in there, and I can forward them through to the presenters, and if appropriate, they can perhaps give you a response. So Nelson likes the characterization of the paradox of accountability. Has anyone encountered an organizational strategy supporting resilience building or crisis management that intentionally incorporates a network strategy, assessing the current network, determine what a good network looks like, and developing a strategy to support improving their network?
Well, I'll just start a response. I think that Nelson was addressing the general audience, and of course, I think I already raised the issue that this is still rather uncharted waters. I mean, we know about strategies, for example, in the political sphere, using social media to try to, create, an outcome. In this case, Obama's election. We know about social media creating opportunities for change, as we saw in Arab Spring. The question is, as I said before, to what extent are these running as parallel but not connected tracks, and to what extent do we see governments or governance structures actively thinking about how to use this? And it's not a simple question, because they operate, hierarchies and networks do operate on some profoundly different principles. So I think as we're increasingly coming to understand, networks are really good at moving knowledge, and they can provoke some action, but only, it seems to be action restricted to fairly limited events and commitments. So you can send in some money, or you can turn up at a square, etc. They're less good at working through a strategy or solving a problem in this kind of way. On the other hand, they are free from these kinds of concerns around accountability, so they can be much more problem-focused without the need, to be constantly managing a political machine that I think most governance structures are involved in. And so, it's not a simple matter just to say to grasp them together, because they, if you will, almost have different kinds of cultures. And so the grasping together, I think, could be very powerful, but requires, some thought and strategy.
Michelle, did you have anything to add there?
No, I would agree with Frances.
Okay. Well, on that note, I'd really like to thank everybody for joining us here today. I just noticed Donna in the chat box is saying, for folks in Toronto, learnings from this particular webinar may be useful for a dialogue that she's hosting on navigating complexity in the water energy nexus, and she has the link there. And Donna, this webinar is being recorded, so depending when we have that ready, you may want to share it with the people at that event. I also just want to let you all know that our next webinar in our Creating a Blue Dialogue series will be happening in March, and we'll be joined by Calvin Sanborn, who is the legal director of UVic's Environmental Law Center. He'll be drawing on a new book entitled Maintaining Supernatural BC for Our Children, Selected Law Reform Proposals, and he'll lead a discussion on recommended changes to British Columbia's environmental laws, which should be quite interesting. So I'd welcome you to come out to that. If you want to see any of our past webinars, head over to